I just wanted to see where I was in the room. Helps me orient. So I don't, I've been looking at some of the information about consciousness hacking. It's not something I was particularly familiar with before this invitation, but I can see in many ways why I'm probably a good fit for the interests of this group. And I guess what I was hoping was to hear right from the start from anybody who's willing, just a thought about what you might be coming to this evening with in terms of an expectation. Is there something you obviously came because you're interested? Is there something specific you're interested in? And not to go into it, just a sentence or two, just so I get a sense a little bit about what you might be, where your interests might lie. I mean, I'm kind of going to do the same thing anyway, but I'm sure that if I hear something, it'll shape how and what I present tonight. So if anyone has a thought that they want to share about what they were or what they are hoping to hear tonight, I would love to hear it. And maybe what we could do is you could just say it from wherever you're sitting, and then Julie can repeat it to make sure that I hear it clearly.
Speak up. Yeah.
Well, I want to start. I read your book and I found it incredibly accessible for what had previously, or maybe still is, kind of a difficult topic to wrap my head around. So I was hoping to hear it again, or hear the main concepts again.
Great.
Yeah. I'm fresh. I want to learn something new. She wants to learn something new.
Okay, great.
Anyone else? What drew you here this evening?
Came in not knowing much about it, so it's just curiosity.
All right, that's good. Great. Fantastic. Okay, so I will dive in, and I kind of made a little bit of I wanted to think about this in terms of consciousness hacking, so that I would be tailoring what I said to the interests of this group, at least as far as I understand them. And I found it interesting. I think the term hacking, the word hacking, on the one hand, I find it appealing, and on the other hand, I see it as potentially problematic. And the reason I say that is because if I think about what we would call spirituality, or what we might call spirituality or awakening, hacking implies a kind of a way to get around the system. And I haven't found a way to get around the system when it comes to spiritual awakening. There's a cost, and there's not really any way to avoid it. But I don't think that renders the term completely. There are other implications of that term that work for spirituality, but the implication that you're going to get somehow go around the system is one that I'm not so sure about. At the same time, the other thing that I write a lot about is paradigm shifting, and in that sense, I think hacking is the only way to get through to actually shift a paradigm. Paradigm shifting, to me, really works. It really is well aligned with the adage of "you can't get there from here." There's nowhere to go inside the current paradigm that's going to allow you to end up at the new paradigm or at a different paradigm. Paradigm shifts are hacks. They are inherently, they're hacks through the existing paradigm into something completely different. And that was a big part of what was in radical inclusivity, where I introduced the idea of wormhole inquiry, which we're going to speak about tonight. So tonight, my intention is to speak specifically about two hacks. And obviously, this is language I'm now incorporating. It's not language I've ever used before tonight. But Uh, the first hack is the hack of meditation, and it allows you to hack through your current experience of consciousness. The second hack is what I call wormhole inquiry, which is essentially a way to use your mind and its capacity for inquiry to shift you into a radically different experience of reality. So it's both of them are ways of hacking out of our current experience of reality into a new one. So the whole point of, as I see it right now, the whole point of the work that I'm doing has to do with shifting a paradigm from what I like to call, and what I know others call, a paradigm of separation to a paradigm of unity. It's a paradigm, the paradigm that we're in is a paradigm which recognizes a universe of empty space filled with things. All of those things are separate from one another. Some of those things are alive, and some of the living things think and have a capacity for consciousness, and we happen to be one of those. So we're a thinking thing, and we operate according to what I would want to call the individual achiever paradigm. So as I like to lay out what our current paradigm is, it's a paradigm of separation which sees a universe of empty space filled with things. Sorry, I got something in my eye. And of those things, there are some which are living, conscious things, which are thinking things like us. And we operate according to the dictates of individual achievement. And that's a paradigm that's been running. Aspects of it have been running for a long time. And in the Western world, it's at least been running full steam ahead for a few hundred years. And it's dramatically upgraded the world in many ways, certainly the human world. I've yet to meet anybody. I meet a lot of people who recognize the shortcomings of the current paradigm, and they recognize the seeds of a lot of our global challenges in the current paradigm. Lots of people. But I haven't yet met anyone who has decided that they want to go back to the dark ages because it was a different paradigm. So we all want to move forward into a new possibility. And that's, essentially what I see this work is about. I've come to the conclusion, I didn't start with any kind of paradigm shifting. That wasn't my orientation. My orientation when I got started, which was 25 years ago or so, was basically a seeker of enlightenment in the Eastern sense. So I was doing a lot of meditation and reading and study and whatever. I didn't really know what enlightenment was, but whatever it was, it sounded, as far as I knew, it just sounded like the ultimate. So since it was the ultimate, I wanted to experience it. But over the years, I've really come to see that maybe a more useful way to speak about awakening. I know someone earlier said, how would you describe awakening? Well, one way that I would describe it would be that it's an awakening in terms of a paradigm. It's an awakening to the recognition that we live inside of a paradigm, and what that means about reality, and what it means about who we are. And I'm going to speak a little bit about that tonight for sure. And spiritually, if I think more in spiritual terms, then when I speak about awakening, I'm speaking about the recognition that we are already whole and complete, that there's nothing missing and never was anything missing. And I feel that those two ways of thinking about awakening go hand in hand. That's why I'll share a hack in the spiritual domain, and I'm going to share a hack in the paradigm shifting domain. And I feel like those two together make a kind of great 1-2 hacking punch in terms of allowing us to become what I have recently liked to call either articulators of new paradigms or artists of possibility. In other words, people who are able to create novel interpretations of reality and thereby expand what becomes possible for everyone. So that's kind of an overview of what I want to share with you today. And I think what I'll share first is some thoughts about what a paradigm is. A paradigm, the word paradigm is is a fairly popular term and becoming more so. So certainly through the second half of the 20th century, it started to become a more publicly used word. It became more part of the popular lexicon. In the last 20 years or so, I think it's become, at least in the circles that you and I are tending to run in, it's become a fairly common word. And I like to go back when I speak about paradigms to share a little bit about at least one of the modern origination points, which is a book called The Structures of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn, who was a historian of science at Princeton University. Have any of you read that book?
Only heard about it, haven't read it. Yeah.
So, I mean, I really think it was certainly very influential on me when I read it. I was an engineer actually at the time that I read it, and it definitely flipped my mind upside down in terms of what I understood to be science. And it really was the book. It was published initially in 1952. It really was the book that kind of introduced this idea of a paradigm. It's not necessarily an easy book to read because it's based in a lot of historical facts about science, and if you don't know those, it feels a bit, plodding. But I do think his description of what a paradigm is incredibly valuable and powerful, and captures the true depth of what it means to live inside of a paradigm. So essentially, I've summarized a lot of I've taught his book a few different times in different settings and try to summarize what he's saying in simpler language. And basically, when he's talking about a paradigm, he's saying it serves a few functions. What a paradigm does, first of all, is it tells you what's real. So it's a series of beliefs and ideas that tell us what reality is. It then effectively shapes our perception so that our perception of reality fits inside what it told us reality was. And then it tells us that what we're seeing is real. So you could see it's a kind of a perfectly closed loop. It first tells you what reality is. It then shapes your experience to fit what it just told you. And then it tells you that your experience is telling you what's real. So there's really no way out because it's dictating the terms all the way through. So Kuhn said in his book, there's only three ways that paradigms ever new paradigms come into existence. In terms of his study of the history of science, there's three ways that paradigms come into existence. One is that some phenomena occurs that just shouldn't be possible. So somebody's discovered something, and based on the paradigm we live in, that shouldn't be possible. So of course, it'll get ignored for a while, but if it's persistent enough, people will stop ignoring it, and eventually that might lead to a radical shift in paradigm, because now we have to explain a phenomena that's not explainable in the current paradigm. Another way that paradigm shift is when there are persistent problems that over long periods of time just cannot be solved inside the paradigm. And the persistence of the problem will force people to start to consider, the foundations of their thinking. So that's the second way paradigm shift. And the third way is that someone just has an almost mystical intuition about a radically different possibility. And it just comes out of nowhere, and it makes perfect sense to them, and they just stick with it long enough to convince other people. And so he looked through the history of science, and he saw that periodically these paradigm shifts happen. They happen in one of those three ways. And what I found most fascinating about the book, or one of the things that's most fascinating, is he says, if you read a modern science textbook, if you go and you pick up a book that's about science, and it's explaining science, or a book about the history of science, the way that it's written from inside this paradigm, from the perspective of this moment, it's written to make it look like science is a kind of continuous linear progression toward greater and greater knowledge. And so he said, when you get a modern textbook, it looks really like science keeps learning and learning and learning and learning and learning. And yes, there are revolutions that change things, but kind of they're more or less a natural consequence. What was happening before led to this revolution. And so there's a kind of linear progress. But he said, when you actually look at not at texts from today describing the history, but you go back and read the original sources. If you read the science textbooks from before a paradigm shift and the science textbooks after, they're like in a different universe. They don't talk to each other at all. The scientists of one era believe a whole bunch of axioms that the other scientists don't believe in at all. They literally, if they were to meet, they wouldn't be able to communicate. So one of the points he makes in the book is that paradigm shifts create unbridgeable gaps. They're discontinuous leaps. There's not a linear progression. It's not a gradual thing. It's a leap that occurs. And that's what made the book both so famous and also so controversial, because human beings, you and I, we gain an enormous amount of security by imagining that we live in a universe that is continuous and progresses linearly. In other words, we get a lot of security from the belief that what happened yesterday is a reasonable predictor of what will happen tomorrow. And so when we start to introduce the idea that there are these discontinuous leaps where what happened yesterday has nothing to do with what happens tomorrow, it at an existential level, it introduces an insecurity that we find intolerable, which is why we write textbooks that make it look like it was predictable. That if they had been smarter, they would have known what we knew. And what Kuhn is saying is that's not the case. So I'm emphasizing this because we're all under that kind of spell. We're still under that spell. We still prefer a kind of linear, progressive understanding of time and history. And we resist. Hang on one second. I think I have someone at the door. I'm sorry.
So that was actually very interesting so far. We might want to read that book. I've heard good things about it. It's actually, and I'm the one who caused the internet slowdown, $8.70 paperback on Amazon, and it's on Audible.
That's an interesting conversation about what's outdated and what's not. Like,
Mhm.
a lot of these discussions
Mhm.
about what's,
Yeah.
you know, like, how far back are you gonna trust it or?
So you got us. We're hooked. Keep going.
Okay. I'll tell you, since you asked. My wife and I have a young guest from Israel staying with us for a few months, and I could hear her struggling with the lock. And I thought, I wonder what's going to happen. And that's what happened. So she's in, and we're all good. We're good to go, and you're all hooked, which I'm happy about.
Great.
So yes, we have this preference for a linear progression. We want to think that the past is a reasonable predictor of the future. And so what happens is, on the one hand, we recognize the need for a paradigm shift, and we speak about the need for a paradigm shift. At the same time, there's a huge part of us, conscious and unconscious, that is desperately holding on to some kind of a progressive, linear relationship to time. And this is a modern retelling of the, age-old dilemma of awakening or enlightenment, because awakening or enlightenment in a spiritual context has always been a discontinuous leap. And the challenge with pursuing it is you actually have to leave where you are to get there. Everything else that we attain is usually, they are things that we add to what already is. And this isn't a thing you add to what already is. A new paradigm isn't something you add to the old paradigm. A new paradigm is a place that you have to leave the old paradigm to get to. And that's what makes it challenging. So I'm thinking about which direction I want to go in.
I thought you were just about to talk about speculative realism, where you left off a second ago.
How did you know I was going to talk about speculative realism? That was one of the directions I could go in. But I think what I want to do is give an example first to help illustrate this point. So I already said that the paradigm that we live in is a paradigm in which we see a universe of empty space filled with things, and we are a thinking thing. And so we, in this paradigm, we believe that we are entities, skin-encased entities that have minds and organs, and that our minds generate thoughts that it's reasonable to conclude are ours. And so now I want to do a little thought experiment with you. I want everybody to close their eyes. I'm having you close your eyes so you don't cheat. And then in the privacy of your mind, I want you to think a random thought. Just any old random thought, one you're pretty sure nobody would be able to guess. Okay, I'm going to assume you've all got one. Now you can open your eyes again. So in the current paradigm, so for instance, I'll tell you what my thought. My thought was a thought about penguins eating cold cut sandwiches out of a refrigerator. That was fairly random, and I bet it was not duplicated anywhere in the room.
Wow. That's crazy.
So now everybody had a random thought, And in the current paradigm, we all assume that the random thought that we thought in our head was one that we generated and it somehow belongs to us. But of course, there's no reason it would have to be that way. How do I know who's the gentleman sitting? Yes. What's his name? Michael. How do I know the thought in my head about penguins eating cold cut sandwiches in a refrigerator wasn't actually yours and it just pops up in my head? And whatever thought popped up in your head might have been mine and I didn't know it. You know, and so these kind of thoughts seem silly, but based on what I said to you earlier, the reason they seem silly has to do with the fact that they stand in direct opposition to what we've already been told is true by the current paradigm. So the current paradigm tells us that the thoughts that appear in our heads are ones that we generate. They're part of our individual achievement. They're an individual achievement of an individual achiever. And because we're told that, we actually definitely experience it that way. I experience that penguin thought as being mine. It feels like mine. It feels like I made it, right? So it then shapes my experience so that it matches what it told me is true. And then because I experience it that way, I believe that must be the way it is. So it's perfectly fine. And if I start to question it, if I start to say, you know, maybe we're all thinking each other's thoughts. Maybe that's the way it works. You know, it seems silly, but it partly seems silly because the paradigm is telling us it's silly. Because paradigms do not want you to ask questions that might take you beyond the paradigm. It's one of the things Thomas Kuhn spells out very much in Structures of Scientific Revolution, that one of the things the paradigm does is it controls what questions you're allowed to ask. And so this is a question you're not really allowed to ask in the current paradigm. You can ask it if you want to, but you just look silly and nobody really will pay much attention to you. But what I'm saying is these are the kinds of questions we need to ask because they're the kinds of questions that can actually hack us out of the current paradigm. And it doesn't mean that they're correct, you know, but they need to be asked because they pose a direct challenge to things that in the current paradigm are held as unquestionable. And exactly what we need to do is question the unquestionable. Alfred North Whitehead said that it takes a very unusual mind to be able to embark on an analysis of the obvious. And that's exactly what we need to do if we're interested in moving beyond the current paradigm. The thing we have to start to question and analyze is what seems most obviously true. And we live in a logical system in which that's not usually what we do. You know, the way if you look at yourself, you'll see you're hardwired to question the things you don't know. If you don't know something, then you start to feel a kind of tension and you want to know it. You're actually almost physiologically driven to question. And if you know something, you relax. Once you figure it out, okay, good, I figured it out, I can relax now. There's no more drive to question. And that's fantastic from the point of view of the current paradigm, because it means that all of its sacred foundational axioms will remain generally unquestioned by almost everybody, which means they'll be able to stay solidly in place and hold us intact. So a lot of what I do with wormhole inquiry is all about questioning the most obvious facts of our experience and taking them seriously. So let me tell you a little bit about what I mean by wormhole inquiry. A wormhole inquiry is not a normal kind of investigation. So this would be a consciousness hack. I didn't have the term before before I talked to Gene about this talk, but now I have the term and I realize the term fits. So In a wormhole inquiry, we take a very obvious part of our experience, like the thoughts that I experience in my mind are mine. That's not a thing that most people question. If you do start questioning that, you usually end up needing some kind of psychiatric help, because you know that's not the kind of question you're allowed to ask and get away with. So we come up with an obvious truth, and then what we need to find is an equally plausible alternative. And by equally plausible, I mean an alternative that fits the facts of our experience as well as that. So I just said, maybe the thoughts in my head are not mine. Maybe they were generated in one of you and just showed up over here. And if you start to think about it, you'll realize that actually could be true. I mean, there's no way to definitively prove it's not true. I mean, you know, maybe there would be a way to definitively prove it's not true, but you'd have to go to great lengths. Sitting here in this room, there's no way to definitively prove it's not true. And if you can keep working with it, you start to feel like, well, how would life change if that were true? Now, the one that this example is one that's sort of particularly difficult and silly, which I chose just to emphasize the wildness of this kind of inquiry. But some of the ones that I use on retreats, for instance, may seem silly at first, but actually are quite reasonable. So we think that the ideas that we have that come out of our heads are coming out of our heads, and they're ours. And we talk about it as me thinking, you know. So on a retreat, I'll have people go outside and look at a tree and think about it. And then I'll say, well, how do you know the thoughts that you're having about that tree came from your head and didn't come from the tree? If you were sitting in front of a different tree, would you have the same thoughts, or would you have different thoughts? And if you'd have different thoughts, which you probably would, then how do you know the thoughts aren't coming from the tree? Because you keep moving. And if you sat in front of a flower, would you have the same thoughts that you had in front of a tree, or would you have different ones? And if you get people to do that for, and you really keep it up for a few hours, you start to realize, wow, I could reconfigure my mind so that I actually experienced thoughts coming out of everything in the world, and my mind is just hearing the thoughts that were coming from the world rather than my mind generating thoughts about the world. And then of course you realize, oh, well, that's how it works in shamanic traditions. That's how indigenous people thought about it. And you start to go, oh, that's just a different paradigm. And I actually don't know which one's right. We just think ours is right. And we have scientific evidence that proves it's right. But if you go into an indigenous culture, they also have evidence that proves their paradigm is correct. So the space that I want to take people is not into that particular idea, for instance. The space I want to take people into is this, in the hack, has to do with coming to the place where you have two equally plausible possibilities, possible explanations of reality. And in that space where you actually start to realize, oh my God, I don't really know which one of these is true. They could both be true. If you keep going in and you keep going in, you actually get to a place where you don't actually know what's real anymore. You start to not know what's real. You start to realize you don't actually know what's real. You just have habits of assuming that you know what's real, but you don't actually know. And that's the space where you sort of start to open into what feels like infinite possibility. And that's where the ground starts to remove under your feet. And this is a place we just don't really want to go. Normally, we don't want to get to a place, because as soon as we start to feel like, oh my God, maybe I don't know what's real, quickly after that thought comes the thought of, oh my God, I think I may be going crazy. Quickly after that comes the thought of, I think I better stop this investigation right now. And then that's the end of that. But, if you think about it, if you really are interested in personally shifting into a different paradigm, there's no way you can avoid passing through a place where you're going to not know what's real. You can't get from one solid experience of reality to something completely different and not experience a radical uncertainty and unknown in between. It's just not possible. And so these kind of hacks are ways of taking us to this space of a kind of radical insecurity, a radical uncertainty about what's real. So that's the paradigm shifting side. And that's the wormhole inquiry paradigm shifting hack. The spiritual hack of meditation, which I say goes hand in hand, because how is any of us going to be able to travel through that kind of radical insecurity? The only way is that we need, because what's being called into question is our experience of reality, our current paradigm, and that's terrifying to us, because that's, for most of us, that's rock solid bottom of what's real, and that is the ground under your feet. And if that starts to feel shaky, everything starts to feel shaky. So spiritual experiences and spiritual awakenings give us a new ground to stand on. It's a ground that isn't inside the mind. It's a ground that has to do with a fundamental contentness with existence prior to having any experience at all. Just the fact of existence itself. And when we're comfortable with that, then we have something to hold on. There's a way to make the journey, because even though the experience of the new paradigm, let's say that it's completely different than the experience of the current paradigm, the one thing that'll be the same on both sides is that there will be existence. And so if we're rooted in a perfect contentedness about existing, then I think that's what gives us the stability to travel to new worlds. And without that, we won't have the stability to do that. So I want to share my meditation hack with you. When I teach meditation, I don't teach a technique in the traditional sense. There's no mantra, and there's no following the breath or visualization or counting. All I teach is to close your eyes and, this is how I give the instruction usually. And I don't have a bell with me, so I'll have to just, say the meditation has begun. But I say, when I begin the meditation, you just don't make a problem out of anything that happens. From that point until I say the meditation is over. And then when I say the meditation is over, there's two parts to the meditation. So the first one is, when I say it's begun, you don't make a problem out of anything that's happened. When I say the meditation is over, you conclude that nothing went wrong, and then you forget about it. You just move on and forget about the meditation. So I want to take you through a practice. So to meditate, it's always good to sit up straight. Put your feet flat on the floor. I mean, that's just basically so that you're comfortable, I think. And, less likely to fall asleep. And in a minute, I'm going to tell you that the meditation has begun. And at that point, I want you to not make a problem out of anything that happens. And then when the meditation's over, I will tell you the meditation is over. And you'll conclude that nothing went wrong. And then you'll let it go. So the meditation has begun. Okay, the meditation is over. How'd that go? No problems? Great work. So that's the 5-second version of what I call the practice of no problem. And so far, everybody that I've ever done that with has done a perfect job, and you guys are no exception. So you all did perfect. And it was easy, right? No problem. Now, if we were to sit for an hour, all you'd have to do is exactly what you just did for 5 seconds. There's nothing else. If we sat for 10 hours, you'd do it. You just don't make a problem out of anything that happens. So you sit in meditation, you don't make a problem. Thoughts come up, other thoughts come up, feelings come up, whatever. You just let it all come up. Then inevitably some thought eventually comes up that says, oh, I don't think this is working. I think you have a problem. Fine. You can let those thoughts come too. Thoughts that tell you you have a problem, you just let them come. You just completely disengage from any kind of problematic relationship to your experience, and you just allow your mind to do or say whatever it wants to do or say. I have an alternative way of giving these instructions that works just as well, which I sometimes use if it feels like the practice of no problem instruction is getting a little stale. And I'll say, during this meditation, I want you to close your eyes and do whatever you want. And then when the meditation ends, conclude that nothing went wrong and forget about it. And it'll basically has the same effect, because the whole point is we've been trained to believe that the experience that we're having is of supreme significance. And so we've been trained to really pay attention to our inner experience and really worry about it and really try to make it perfect, and we spend an enormous amount of energy trying to control and manipulate our inner experience to get it to be the way we want it to be, so that we can be, happy. And this is training you to do just the opposite, which is not care at all what your inner experience is. Literally doesn't matter what your mind is doing or how you feel. At least during that time of meditation, you could be in blissful rapture with the divine, or you could be completely bored and frustrated, with a monkey mind. And it literally is equivalent. They're just two different experiences. Neither one is more significant than the other, for this meditation at least. And all you're doing is being okay. You're just practicing being okay, no matter what your experience is. So if you have the great, divine, blissful experience, okay. If you have the frustrated monkey mind, okay. It really doesn't matter. If you're angry, it doesn't matter. It's just an experience. So we're going to sit again, this time longer than 5 seconds. And I just want you to really make the effort to follow these instructions and not make a problem out of anything that happens, no matter what it is. And you can begin. Okay, thank you very much. Did anyone find it difficult to not have a problem? Did anyone find themselves get caught up in a problem? Get caught up in trying to do something or solve something?
I find myself trying to create problems. Like things are going along fine, and then someone might try to create new problems to solve.
You're gonna have to repeat that, I think.
He found himself trying to create problems.
Aha, right. So this is interesting. So you found yourself trying to create problems, and what's tricky about because in the end, there's a whole other level of hacks that we could talk about, consciousness hacks, which have to do with language. So in that statement, the language hack would be, you said, I found myself trying to create problems. If you change the language and said, my mind was trying to create problems, and you didn't claim, but we have this individual achiever habit, which means that we always claim credit for everything that happens. Even though a lot of things we claim credit for, we wouldn't know how to do it if we tried. But it just happens and we claim credit. We say, I did that. I thought that thought. Even though I don't know how to make a thought. I don't even know what thoughts are made of. I just find them in there. I just look and there they are. I have no idea where they come from. But we have a habit of claiming ownership to it. So if your mind is trying to create problems, but you don't say, I'm trying, as soon as you say, I'm trying to create problems, then you've got a problem. But as long as it's your mind creating problems, you can let it do that all day. And that's what in the way I teach meditation, that this particular hack is, you just let your mind go. You want to create problems? Knock yourself out. I'm just here meditating. If creating problems is your thing, you can do that. I'm just going to sit here because this is my meditation time. So what you get caught up in is the habit of being an individual achiever who does things like has thoughts, who creates problems. So you get sucked back into that identity, and I'm giving you permission to let go of that identity and just let all that stuff happen. So then something interesting starts to happen if you pursue this a little bit, because you start to realize, you just be logical about it. Let's say you're going to sit for half an hour, and you have a timer. It's going to ring a bell, and then a half hour later it's going to ring another bell, and you know that no matter what happens during that half hour, you're not going to make a problem out of it, which means it literally doesn't matter what happens in that half hour. Then it starts to dawn on you that since it doesn't matter what happens and none of it's going to be a problem, I don't really even have to pay attention to any of it. Why bother paying attention? It's all going to be fine anyway, and I'm not going to do anything about it. So you start to feel like, I don't have to pay attention. And when you start to feel like you don't have to pay attention, something interesting happens, which is you actually stop paying attention to what's happening in your experience. And sometimes you have these dramatic moments where you realize that you're not there anymore. Obviously you're still in existence, but you're not, your attention hasn't been fixated on your mind's, on the theater of your mind, which is where it's been glued to and where we've all been trained to have it glued to all the time. But when your attention slips out of the theater of the mind, the world of the known, it doesn't go to some other theater. It just goes into blank. It's just gone. It slips into what you could call non-conceptual awareness. There's presence, but there's nothing that you're aware of, because you've sort of slipped out of the normal subject object experience of reality, and you're just in what I don't know what you're not in anything from a certain point of view. You're just gone. You've just slipped into non-existence, or at least that's how it feels. And if in meditation you learn to get more and more comfortable there, then when you sit, you just close your eyes and disappear. And then the meditation overs and you reappear. And you just took a vacation from the experience of reality, essentially. And it's very different from losing consciousness, because you are conscious. You're just not conscious of anything in particular. And I feel like that, being that comfortable with existence itself outside of any particular experience is what we need to be rooted in, so we can make this journey into a new paradigm. Yeah, so rooting yourself through, at least the way I work. So next week I'm going to be leading a week-long retreat, and every morning we'll be immersing ourselves in meditation practice with the goal of just resting in this space of non-existence, this space of emptiness, what the Buddhists would call emptiness, and just acclimating. To me, it's a matter of acclimating, because a lot of meditation, a lot of the ways that meditation can be taught emphasize the sort of journey to get to emptiness. And I guess the hack here is I'm trying to teach meditation in a way that gets you to emptiness as fast as possible, essentially immediately, because to me the real value is resting in emptiness so that you can get acclimated to the experience of non-existence, so you can start to relax and rest there. So that's the meditation posture, that's the meditation hack. And then I already introduced the wormhole inquiry hack, which is we question some of the most obvious, unquestionable truths about reality by juxtaposing them against a viable alternative, until we actually start to experientially not know what's real anymore. And we won't freak out when we don't know what's real, because we're rooted in this non-existent space of meditation, which gives us the stability to not freak out when we start to not know what's real. And then this is where I feel like the hack metaphor breaks down, because I don't think there's nothing that we can do to create a new paradigm. A new paradigm has to emerge. As Thomas Kuhn said, they come through these mystical-like revelations. We're not going to construct a new paradigm out of old paradigm elements. But when we're sitting in that place where we're, resting in emptiness and not knowing what's real, that's a place of radical availability, because we have completely detached ourselves from the current paradigm, which means we're available to be used as part of the building blocks of something else. And that's where, inspirations, insights, visions can take you to places you couldn't have imagined and you couldn't have constructed. And to me, that's what this is about, is bringing ourselves to a place where we're available to be the visionaries of a new paradigm. And visionaries are people that are getting insight and understanding and wisdom from someplace other than their mind, other than what they already know. And to do that, we need to become profoundly available And so that's essentially an outline of my, I can, a lot of that is the ideas from radical inclusivity, reconfigured into the shape of consciousness hacks for the benefit of this particular audience. But before because I have another hack that a sort of example hack I want to do with you, but I wanted to also open up some space here for any questions that might have come up. And again, Julie will have to do a little.
Back in the back corner.
Yeah, we're doing like a mic check kind of thing.
Can I just speak up?
We'll repeat your question. The mic is right here.
When you talk about being in the space where you have most availability for a new paradigm, there's a movie that came up to my mind that I really want to be in that space called The Arrival. Have you seen that movie, The Arrival? It's about a whole new paradigm in science fiction when it first came out, the movie. It's based on a book, a science fiction book that was very well received, and they say that it's one of the newest science fiction movies that shifted like none of the other science fiction in the last 20 years. If you see the movie, you may want to say something about it. Because when I first saw the movie, I was kind of wondering what kind of science fiction it is. And by the end of the movie, I realized that I'm a wholly different mind space. It's like it reset my way of thinking. With language, with art, time, and space. I want to know what the speaker think about that movie.
Did you hear him?
I heard some. Basically, he was talking about the movie Arrival and the book that it's based on, and it sounded like he was amazed by how it really portrayed, the depth of what a paradigm is. Everything's different in a paradigm, in a paradigm shift. And I agree. And interestingly enough, I saw that film, a couple of months ago, and not just that film. There were a few convergent science fiction things that happened into my life at the same time. And about 2 weeks ago, I started writing a science fiction novel because I realized that there's things I can communicate in a novel that I won't be able to communicate in another book of prose. So yes, I thought the movie was amazing, and it definitely profoundly conveyed it's not, there's something called the Flintstone fallacy. And I don't know if you've heard that term, but the Flintstone fallacy is the Flintstones cartoon, where it was a cartoon about cavemen from, cavemen times, whenever they were. But the Flintstones basically talk like modern people. They drive cars. Everything was the same, except, they wore clothes, like everything was the same, except stuff was made out of rocks and clothes were made out of animal skins. But besides that, everything was the same. And that's often, so the Flintstone fallacy is when we project our modern sensibilities into the past. And I wish, I don't think I could do this, but I wish I could go back and live a day inside of the consciousness of a medieval serf, because I suspect it would be so radically foreign to my sensibilities that I wouldn't even recognize myself or anything. It would just be a completely different kind of existence. And I think that's what the movie conveys is how radically different a new paradigm is. Now, we do that going backwards in terms of the Flintstone fallacy. We kind of project our current sensibilities on the past. But even when we project into a new paradigm, we tend to project our current sensibilities into the future. And so the future is like better gadgets. You could call it the Jetsons fallacy. They have, they have highways that are multidimensional, and everyone flies around in a little spaceship, and technology has advanced, but they basically still have modern consciousness, the consciousness that we have. So yes, it's a great film, and it definitely illustrates part of the point that I want to make, which is the leap into a new paradigm is a kind of wholesale shift into something that we can't imagine. And so that's why we have to be prepared and train for that kind of a journey.
Since we're kind of in that sci-fi space, Jeff, could you talk a little bit about speculative realism and what it's doing in our culture and its roots in pragmatism and American thought?
Sure. So speculative realism is a small philosophical school that's developed over the last about 6 years or so. One of its proponents is a professor at Rice University named Timothy Morton, whom I've studied quite a bit. I've read a number of his books and had a few conversations with him. And the essential idea of speculative realism is this. During the sort of first half of the 20th century, there was a big shift in philosophy. So up until that point in Western philosophy, a great deal of what philosophers did was try to make up theories about reality. And Hegel is often thought of as one of the, he created one of the last great theories of everything, just people who would just try to figure out, okay, what is this thing called reality? How does it all work? What's really going on here? And people would come up with their theories, and then someone else would come up with a theory. And then in the 20th century, philosophy went through what's sometimes called the linguistic turn. And a number of philosophers started to say, well, you know what? We could talk about reality until we're blue in the face. But the fact is, we have to talk about it in language. We don't even understand how language works or how language points or how a language actually identifies reality. And so the philosophy became more analytic. And by analytic, it meant it was largely became preoccupied with analyzing language. So that's the kind of philosophy many of us encountered, where you're just breaking down logic and breaking down sentences and modifiers and what's modifying what and what, if, the logic stream of if A is B and B is, so it was almost making it mathematical. And one of the big proponents of that was Bertrand Russell, an English philosopher who also happened to be a mathematician. So it was right up his street, so to speak. So what the speculative realists thought, and certainly what Timothy Morton thinks, is that that linguistic turn made philosophy less creative and more critical. And so philosophy became more about criticizing texts, criticizing theories, and we've entered into a time that Morton calls cynical realism. And he said, in the age of cynical realism, the way that you get ahead in the academy as an academic is by tearing down other people's theories. So if you want to get tenure, you write papers that show that somebody else's theory doesn't make sense. And that's how you get kudos for that. And it creates an academic environment where very few people are willing to put forward any kind of original thinking, any kind of an original theory, because they know every graduate student around is going to start hacking it apart as soon as it hits as soon as it's published. So another professor from Rice University who's sympathetic to this way of thinking, his name is Jeffrey Kripal. He writes amazing books about the history of the modern, the history of alternative spiritual movements. He wrote a big book about Esalen that was very well received, and he's written a number of other books about UFOs, about just all kinds of very interesting alternative spirituality. And he said, I could never write any of that stuff if I wrote it, as things that I believed in. It wouldn't get published. So what he does is he finds historical figures that believe the same kinds of things that he believes, and he writes about them. And he lets all of his ideas come out of the mouth of a historical figure, and then his books gain praise, and they're able to be published because they're not ideas to be criticized. They're historical books. So the speculative realists come on the scene, and they say, okay, look, let's just deal with the facts here. We're in a global mess, and we don't seem to have solutions to solve it. And, we've been trying on things like global warming for decades. And it's not that there aren't incredibly intelligent people working on it and who are super motivated to solve the problem. We're just not able to solve it inside the current paradigm. It's not solvable, so the kind of radical shift that needs to happen, which is what we're all talking about tonight, isn't going to happen through the activity of philosophical critique. That's not going to get us where we need to go. So the whole idea of speculative realism is we need to speculate wildly and generate alternative conceptions of reality in the hopes that we're going to expand our conception of reality in a direction that's going to open up possibilities that are currently not available to us. And Timothy Morton himself is very, very motivated by climate change, which he refuses to call climate change. He said calling it climate change is part of the PR wash job around global warming because climate change doesn't sound so bad. Climates change. That's what they do. They change every year. Winter changes. But actually, the globe is warming up is what's really happening. And that's a problem. So the reason I connect speculative realism to American pragmatism, which is what Gene was asking, is because one of the tenets of pragmatism, at least of the philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce, who he and William James are generally seen as the originators of pragmatism, his tenet was never block the road to inquiry. And the surest way to block the road to further inquiry is to think that you know. Because once you know, you stop inquiring. And so he had a philosophy he called fallibilism, which is really built into pragmatism, which is that no matter what you think you know, you're wrong. And eventually you'll figure out that you're wrong. And if you don't figure it out in your lifetime, someone else will figure it out later. So any kind of an idea about reality is just, it's really the best guess so far, and it should be held to as true for as long as it's useful. And that's what essentially the philosophy of pragmatism tells you, that truth should be determined by the value of an idea, not by its connection to some believed reality. So if an idea is working, if it's having a positive consequence, then that's as true as it gets to a pragmatist. It isn't true in any kind of ultimate sense. So yes, I feel like my wormhole inquiries, and when I talked with Timothy Morton about some of what I do, he was very affirmative and just felt like, his more or less exact quote was, "I'm just supporting anybody who's trying to do something different that might work, because we need, we're in such desperate need of expanded imagination and new solutions that it would be silly to slow anybody down who was inspired to try something." And that's kind of the spirit of speculative realism, is that everyone is encouraged to use their minds, not just to critique and criticize the ideas that already exist, but to generate new ideas that might take us places we've never been before. So that's speculative realism, Gene, at least as it connects to my work.
Yeah, Michael?
So in light of what you were just saying and all the talk of paradigm shifts, I'm curious how you would suggest thinking about testing the legitimacy of outlandish claims. So if someone claims to be a psychic, for example, then in the current paradigm, you would want to test their claims with the scientific method. But they could say, well, you know, I'm coming from a different paradigm where the scientific method no longer applies. So how do you separate the charlatans from the legitimate?
Well, clearly that would be, you know, that's one of the, you know, that's definitely a challenge with this point of view. And I certainly wouldn't, I wouldn't want to go to a wholesale believe anything anybody says paradigm. What I'm saying is that we, you know, we live in a very conservative climate, and I don't mean just politically, although we do also politically, but academically, intellectually. You know, one of the things that Jeffrey Kripal, whom I just mentioned at Rice University, does studies on, which is really fascinating, is how in the late 1800s, you know, science was just really booming. You know, 1860, 1870, new ideas about electricity and magnetism. I mean, it was theories where everybody thought everything was going to be figured out, you know, in a few decades, because so much was happening. And in universities, only science departments were starting to consolidate a level of power that they never had before. You know, they were getting grants, people were spending money. At the very same time, there was this global movement called spiritualism, which, you know, involved psychics and mediums of all kind. And there was a concerted effort on the part of science departments to discredit spiritualism as, you know, phony baloney BS, because they didn't want any challenge to their, because if it was true, you know, if some of the things that psychics were claiming they could do, they could actually do, then it would call into question some of the fundamental axioms of the scientific worldview in a way that didn't want to be challenged. So there was so what Kripal looks at is the history of how there was a concerted effort to discredit psychics and mediums and et cetera, et cetera. And then he goes and he looks at the actual evidence from the time, and it's very fascinating. It's not that any of that stuff was ever proven, because it was really never looked into. But there's lots of things that happened that were never disproven either. They were just simply ignored. And so William James, who I just mentioned as one of the founders of pragmatism, he was very interested in psychic phenomena and spent a lot of his time exploring it, and mostly debunked everything that he discovered. I mean, most of what he found, he discredited over time. But there was one medium that he knew for about 30 years, and she did things like she would routinely help the police find bodies. So they would give her a piece of somebody's clothes, and she would go into a state, and she would bring them to a river, and the body would be there. And he said it happened over and over and over again, and not once in 30 years did he ever see anything that discredited her. But that just, you know, so from his point of view, he thought, well, we should be studying that, which is exactly your point. But not to discredit it, but to see, is it true? Because here's this woman, and she can do this amazing thing. How come, you know, what he was amazed at was that science wasn't interested. There was a foregone conclusion that it couldn't be happening, it wasn't possible, and therefore it must be bull, and so there's not even any reason to look at it. And so those things were never. So I was listening to this, and I was thinking, oh yeah, I was totally on board, particularly when he talked about like mystical experiences, because I dedicated my whole life to mystical experiences, and I often, and you know, I'm always encountering people who think that my experiences are just BS. But of course, they're real to me. But how can I prove it? And so, I was totally with it. And then he started talking about UFOs, and I felt myself go, oh, that's bullshit. And I really had to laugh because I thought, oh my God, because I haven't had a UFO experience. So in that domain, I'm totally with the kind of dominant scientific paradigm of I just dismiss it without even thinking about it. I've never looked into it. I don't know the first thing about it. There's nothing upon which my opinion that it's bullshit is resting. It's just something I absorbed. I mean, I literally have no knowledge to base that on. And I just laughed at myself because I've been holding that position for a long time and I never thought to question it. So then I started doing some research into UFOs. And I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. There's all this data that nobody's really ever been able to explain, and nobody seems to really care to explain. And somehow I just bought into the party line about it being BS. So yes, absolutely. I think the kind of claims that people make about alternate paradigms, I think they should be looked at. I don't actually think it's that hard to debunk people who are really totally charlatans. I mean, I've met lots of total charlatans. I didn't find them that hard to see through. But what I think is more interesting is, and what I would want to make sure also happened, was that we were putting real scientific inquiry into those people that weren't obviously charlatans. And we're actually trying to figure out how they were able to do the things they appeared to be doing. This is definitely absolutely not a kind of believe anything anybody says. And I would just want the inquiry to go all around. And then let's see, then that'll be fascinating. I mean, what William James said, even back, 100 years ago was, because he had the same kind of speculative realist attitude where he said, most of science, and to be honest, Thomas Kuhn said this again, in Structures of Scientific Revolution. He said 90% or 95% of science is what he called normal science, which is basically scientists refining what they already know to greater and greater detail, and to use it to discover new tech, whatever you do, find new technology, solve problems. But the vast majority of scientific work is done in domains that are pretty well established. And it's much harder to get grant money and research money to work at the fringes of science. The places way out there that 90% of the scientists don't believe in, but there's 10% of the scientists that are sure that this is going to be the next universe. They don't really get any funding because it's too far out. And James said, well, we should live in a world that's the opposite, because we know the next huge breakthrough isn't going to come from what we already know. It's going to be one of these fringy things. We don't know which one, but we should actually put more of our attention on the fringes, because even if 90% of them are going to turn out to be, blind alleys, one of them is going to turn out to be the entire future of the universe. And we should be looking for that one, but we don't. Because we're very conservative by nature. So we want to, as James put it, we want to work on expanding what we already know rather than exploring what we don't know. And so science tends to move in this kind of very slow process of expansion, which Kuhn also says, of course, until one of these things that's way out on the fringe gains so much attention that it can't be ignored anymore. And then the whole center shifts to a new center, and that becomes a new paradigm. So yes, I think great question, and absolutely we should be exploring and debunking. I know, because this kind of conversation, it's ripe for creating the opportunity for any charlatan to make up anything and call it speculative realism. So yeah, that would be unacceptable and a complete waste of time.
I have begun to wonder, Jeff, as I read more and more, it seems that we have a real worship of this notion of scientific inquiry.
Absolutely.
Many, many other ways of knowing. And as you were describing your own experience, I was thinking about phenomenology. It is particularly a way of knowing that a lot of people don't think about or realize exists, because they have this popular notion of scientific experimentation and scientific proof. But there's heuristic evaluation and action inquiry and so many ways of knowing. And one of the things that the Enlightenment brought us was this notion of science being a superlative way of knowing, which tends to marginalize a lot of these human experiences. There was a scientist who spoke to the Palo Alto chapter who said something that was like earth-shaking and paradigm-shifting for me. He said, things were true before science proved them true. Well, that's really true. Yeah.
She said things were true before science proved them true.
Yes, that's right. Science was not needed to make something true.
Right. Interesting. I'm finding that interesting because Thomas Kuhn says almost exactly the opposite.
If science is needed to make something true?
No, it's a little bit different, but I'm going to share it with you just to see, because I think it might illuminate this domain. You know, he has this whole thing in Structures of Scientific Revolutions about Joseph Priestley and Lavoisier, two scientists, one English, one French. Priestley discovered the ether, the gas that's ether. You know, that's the all-pervasive gas, and he did it by separating out water into a gas. And a year later or so, some years later, Lavoisier repeated the experiment, got the same result, same experiment, same result, but he realized that it wasn't ether that he had discovered, it was oxygen. And so there's been a raging debate in science over who discovered oxygen. Was it oxygen when Priestley discovered it and thought it was ether? Or did it become oxygen when Lavoisier called it oxygen and everybody adopted that language? And I get what you're saying about, you know, the physical facts were physical facts before science labeled them as such, which is true. And science is a whole paradigm that, you know, like that gentleman in the back talked about the movie Arrival. It's got a whole language. It's not the idea that science is discovering facts is actually part of the myth of science.
Yeah.
Science is a worldview that keeps expanding itself. And you really have to step back and think about, because the whole way in which facts are thought about in a scientific paradigm is a particular way to think about facts, which all needs to be thrown into question if we're going to move past the current paradigm, which is very much dominated by a scientific view.
Yeah.
That goes to the debate now that they don't actually have an actual number for the speed of light. And they haven't had like 26, 27 years. So they come up with this thing and they've got some groups, there's two scientific groups that meet. They're still meeting to come up with what they feel is definitive actual number for the speed of light. And obviously that affects all the light science stuff, and really relativity and everything else that we know, because it's predicated on what the speed of light is. So if you don't actually know what the speed of light is, you don't really know necessarily that you're really in the ballpark, and a whole bunch of stuff is in flux. So but they have been trying to keep that quiet so that people like regular scientists that aren't in that field don't actually have to debate that issue, or they just use this number. That's all everybody's always used. So. found that out actually it's on YouTube.
So I didn't hear all of that, but I think from what I heard, I'm gathering that what you're bringing forth is this kind of state of current science and what it does and doesn't know. And how I want to respond to that is that, which is something I haven't mentioned tonight, but which is I find kind of funny, because we often talk about the fact that we live in a scientific paradigm and a scientific worldview, and I get that, it's true. But what's really interesting is we don't actually live in a scientific paradigm. We live in the scientific paradigm from about 300 years ago.
Yes.
You know, there's the scientific paradigm we live in isn't even the scientific paradigm of science today. It's a science, you know, in the 1800s, or we're living in a conception of science that's totally pre-relativity, totally pre-quantum mechanics. You know, we're centuries behind in terms of our worldview.
Why do you think that persists, Jeff? Even in the technology community, that persists. Do you have any notion?
Yeah, I mean, I think it persists because the more modern science, which I think is part of what the gentleman was saying, it's very difficult to understand. It's going to take time for it to be articulated clearly enough that, you know, that people are going to really be able to understand it well enough. And, you know, most people, you know, so yes, there are people, like you said, in technology who may understand or may not, you know, but that's kind of like in the Middle Ages, even though they were still living in the consciousness of the Middle Ages, there were people, I mean, you go back and read, you know, some of the great thinkers from, you know, even 1100, and you're like, wow, this person was really on the ball. But they're still living in a collective field that includes a lot of people who aren't nearly thinking at that level. So I'm sure it's very complicated, you know, how a paradigm is upheld. And I guess it's just going to take more time. But I think it's a really important point to make, that like when I speak about the things in space paradigm that we live in, you know, a universe of infinite empty space filled with things, that was definitely a medieval conception. That is a way pre-relativity conception of time and space, but it is the one we live in. I think it's also because our perceptual apparatus more readily sees at a level where that kind of science is more perceptible. Now, what I think is going to be interesting is that as we shift into a paradigm which is more rooted in relativity and quantum mechanics, for instance, I think that's going to have associated perceptual shifts so that we're actually going to see relativity and quantum mechanics. You know, there's this great Wittgenstein quote where and I hope I get this right, he basically asks someone, so it's a very similar question. Why do you think it took so long for people to realize that the sun, that the earth is rotating? And his friend said, well, obviously it's because it looks like the sun is going around the earth. And Wittgenstein said, what would it look like if the earth was rotating? So, you know, and it's a great quote because obviously this is what it looks like if the earth is rotating, because that's what the earth is doing. And it only seemed obvious that the sun was going around the earth because we lived in a paradigm that told us that's what it was doing. And so that's the reason why it's so hard to change paradigms is exactly for that reason, because we're told the way things are, and then our perceptions are filtered to make it look like that's the way it is, and then we're told that because it looks that way, that must be the way it is. So it's kind of a perfect loop. That's why it's so hard to get out of. That's why we're living in a in a worldview based on science from a few hundred years ago. And yeah, I think it's utterly fascinating.
And sometimes if you actually see things differently, there's a prescription for that.
Yeah, right, exactly. No, totally. If you see things differently and then you keep insisting on it, you can end up in an institution. Totally. So as we have just a few minutes left, look, it's like almost midnight and I'm totally pumped up now. This is so fun. I wanted to introduce this last wormhole inquiry because I think it's my favorite one because it kind of weds the different threads that we've been talking about together, and what it's directly challenging is the belief that we are subjects that experience objects, and this is one of the utter cornerstones of the current paradigm, which was, in modern times at least, really ushered in by Rene Descartes, who basically said that we basically live in two realms, the realm of the mind and the realm of extension or physicality. And we, as inner subjects, we experience outer objects. And so that's really one of the pinnacles of a paradigm of separation, which is that I am an observer of things that are separate from me. That's one of the cornerstones of separation. Just like, I live in a universe of things in space. I'm a subject that observes things that are separate from me. Leads to a paradigm of separation. It leads to dualistic thinking rather than non-dualistic thinking because it sees separation. It sees the thinker as separate from that which it thinks about. Which, oh my God, there's so many. My book, actually, when it comes out, you'll all have to read it because I go through all kinds of different examples of these kind of inquiries. So this inquiry is, I might try and give you two in the 10 minutes we have left. So this one is, it's basically posing the question, what if there's no one experiencing the experience that you think you're having? So what if nobody is experiencing the experience that you think you're having? And I've appropriated this to some extent from William James, who he came up with he actually coined the term the stream of consciousness. And he said, I don't think there is any being called me that's having an experience. I think there's just, and he said, if I look at my experience, what I actually see is there's an experience of something, and then there's an experience of me experiencing something, and then there's more experience of the something, and then there's more experience of me experiencing it. But all of those are experiences. There's no actual me having an experience. There's experiences of objects, and then there's experiences of experiencing, and then there's more experiences, and then there's more experiences of experiencing, but there's no actual me that I can ever find in there. So this is a classic spiritual contemplation in the William James, the way that he saw it. His philosophy was actually picked up by a school of Japanese Zen and became essentially the central point of a whole school of Zen philosophy in Japan. So the question is, what if nobody is having the experience that you think you're having? And if you really start to look into that in the way that William James did, you can start to say, well, what if all of reality was just experience? What if there was no even, because even a physical thing is an experience. Anything I touch, I'm experiencing. Anything I measure scientifically is an experience of measuring something scientifically. The only thing we actually have access to is experiences. So Immanuel Kant, when he wrote the Critique of Pure Reason, part of what he was realizing was this: all we actually have access to is experience. Everything, I never experience something. I only have an experience of experiencing it. So you could say, well, no, but I measured the height of the table. But all you had was an experience of measuring the height of the table. And so Kant said, okay, so this is his solution to this dilemma, was to say, all right, I get it. There's noumena and phenomena. And phenomena is what we experience, and noumena is this mysterious, unknowable reality behind what we experience. Something we can never actually experience, we can never know what it is, but we know it's there because it's generating the phenomena that we do experience. And you know, that's, Kant is considered the beginning of modern philosophy, and that's essentially his primary insight. Now, obviously, we don't have time to go into everything, but Timothy Morton points out that Kant came up with that philosophy, which Morton says was a philosophy that in the modern age created an undividable gap, an indivisible gap between us and reality. So now all we had access to was phenomena, and reality was beyond our reach, permanently and forever. And Morton points out that that philosophy was being developed at exactly the same time that the modern steam engine was invented, which is exactly the time, you know, when they started using all these steam engines and burning all the coal for the steam engines, is exactly the time that when you do archaeological studies of the Earth's crust, that you find the first layers of carbon deposited by human technology in the record of rock layers, which some people call the beginning of the Anthropocene. And the Anthropocene is that geologic age in which humans dominate even the Earth's crust. And Morton points out that he doesn't think it's a coincidence that Kant created a philosophy that separated us from reality at exactly the same time that a device was created that began the process of global warming that could destroy our reality. Obviously, this is not something one can prove, but it's especially if you read Morton write about it rather than hear me tell you about it. It opens up a very compelling argument. So the first wormhole inquiry is the question: what if nobody's having the experience that you think you're having? The second one that I just want to mention briefly, because I want to give Charles Sanders Peirce equal space to William James. Peirce is one of my favorite philosophers. He was working in the 1870s, 1880s. Arguably the greatest American genius ever, still to this day. I know you guys, I think, maybe it wasn't you, maybe it was some other chapters, but spoke with Ken Wilber recently. But Ken credits Peirce with the first articulation of the four-quadrant model. Peirce was trying to create a philosophy based on a three model, which was I, we, it. Ken took that and added its to make it a four-quadrant model. So Peirce, one of his jobs was he worked for the U.S. Coast Guard survey, and he would measure, he was mapping the floor, the ocean floor near the shore. So they would drop plumb lines, get depth measurements every 10 feet, and then create a relief map of the ocean floor. And Peirce noticed, like all scientists do, that you can drop a plumb line in there, 10 times and get 10 different measurements. And so you always, as we all learned in high school, you always have to account for human error in your measurements. You make a bunch of measurements and you take the average, and the average is going to be better than any one of the individual measurements because any one might be off because of human error. Now, Peirce was known to be a bit arrogant. And he thought I don't think I'm making any mistakes with this plumb line. What I actually think is that reality isn't stable the way we thought it was. I think everything's fluctuating all the time, so that when I make my second measurement, the actual length has changed. It's not that I'm measuring it wrong. It's that reality has changed. And he started writing philosophy about the fact that reality is not fixed. It's always changing. And, obviously it seemed preposterous in the 1870s when he was writing it, but, he was a genius and he made a good point. Interestingly enough, his ideas were part of the inspiration of Werner Heisenberg when he came up with Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, because he realized Peirce was right. Every time you make a measurement, you actually change the thing you're measuring. So when you make a second measurement, it's not going to be the same because you've already changed it. And at the atomic level, you can really see this. But part of the inspiration for Heisenberg's uncertainty principle was Peirce's papers about the plumb lines measuring the ocean floor, and his belief that actually it might be the ocean floor that was changing and might not actually be his measurements were wrong. And so, that's another kind of wormhole inquiry example that he was into, which is the obvious truth is that the measurement stays the same and we're wrong. The alternative explanation is that actually the measurement is changing and we're right. And it fits the facts equally well. So anytime you find an alternative explanation that fits the facts equally well, it has to put you in a place where you're not certain which one is true, which means that you get propelled into that place of not knowing what's real, which is the incredible spaciousness that would allow for whole new levels of insight and understanding to emerge through you. And the way that we're going to be able to live through that, the way that we're going to be able to be stable through that, is by anchoring ourselves in the experience of emptiness, where we are so comfortable with bare existence that we can withstand the insecurity of not knowing what's real long enough to allow something else to emerge, rather than recoil back into the familiar, which is all too often what happens. And so with that, it is exactly midnight, and I have utterly enjoyed speaking with you all.
Thank you. Let us know when the book comes out.
What's that?
Let us know when the book comes out.
I definitely will. I will completely let you know. I'm waiting with bated breath myself.
Okay.
Can you restate the second wormhole inquiry?
What's that?
Do you have a snappy little sentence like you had for the first wormhole inquiry?
No. You'll have to come up with one for yourself.
Okay.
All right. Good night, Jeff.
All right. Bye, you guys. Thank you so much.